But we're going to see just how important Genesis 10 is in the scheme of things in this session, which is entitled When the Most High Divided the Nations. And that's what we were reading about, the division of mankind that came from the loins of Noah into 70 nations. That's why there were a lot of names in that chapter, because there are 70 nations that ultimately came out of the rebellion of Nimrod. Now, in this particular session, there's going to be some relatively simple things, and there's going to be things that are going to require you to think. So I'll tell you when I want you to pull your thinking caps on a little firmer, because you'll need to do so. But if you do that, you are going to see some astonishing things here in this record, brothers and sisters. The way that this has been couched by the Spirit is just astonishing. So let's move into it and see what we can make of this chapter. Now, we've got, of course, the two lines. You've got the blue line and the red line, as one or two brethren call it. You've got the line of Abel, which, of course, was taken up by Seth after his murder by Cain, there on the left-hand side of the screen. And then there's the successive generations: Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, the father of Noah, and Noah himself, who was the subject of our first study. On the other side of that equation, coming from Adam, you've got Cain, the firstborn, probably, most likely, as Brother Thomas suggests, born as a result of the first union between Adam and Eve in circumstances that were not good. So Eve said of Cain, "I have begotten a man-child from Yahweh." She was wrong. She'd begotten a man-child from the serpent. Cain was the seed of the serpent. And of course his line continued: Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Methusael, Lamech. We're going to talk a bit about Lamech. He's the seventh from Adam. Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal came. Okay, so this is the line, the red line, the serpent line on the other side. As you can see, there's a serpent down the bottom. And of course on this side we've got Noah, who ended up with his family in the ark. Just 8 of 2 billion people, they say, were saved in that Holocaust 1656 years after the creation of man. So what happened here? Well, what happened was that Enoch and Lamech found themselves as antagonists. Now you might recall, maybe we should do this little exercise. We should go to the Epistle of Jude, second last book in the Bible, just before the Apocalypse, and see how important this dispute was between Enoch and Lamech. Now I'm going to have to be a bit disciplined here, because it would be very easy for me to go off into tangents and to talk about a number of things which time won't permit. In Jude, and at verse 14, we read this: And Enoch also the seventh from Adam. So why do you want to know that? Why do you think the Spirit, through Jude, tells you that Enoch was the seventh from Adam? Well, the whole point of the Epistle of Jude, of course, is that he's exposing what Peter said was going to happen. In his second epistle, Peter prophesied of a time when improperly converted people would come into the brotherhood and would continue to live as they'd lived before they became Christadelphians. Now, that wouldn't happen today, would it? We wouldn't have that happen today. We wouldn't have people come into the truth who continue to live like they were before they came to the truth. Well, I'm telling you, it is happening. Okay? And it happened in the days of Jude. And he's showing the fulfilment of Peter's prophecy. And these people, of course, he calls certain men crept in unawares. Evil men. And he tells us they're like Cain. They're like Balaam. And so on. Okay, so you've got your context. They're also like Lamech. They're like Lamech. And he tells us that Enoch is the seventh from Adam, because so is Lamech on the other side. And I want to show you that the reason that Jude uses Lamech is because he was the perfect example of those that Jude says in the earlier verses, in verse 4, who would turn the grace of God into license. The word in the King James is lasciviousness. It means license. Right? But he is the type. He's the type of all of those who thereafter would act as though they were members of the brotherhood, but were in fact the seed of the serpent. Okay, got a bit of a picture? So what happens here in verse 14? And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these. And the these he's talking about are the certain men crept in unawares, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed. You get the idea that there might be some ungodliness going around? All right, yeah. Ungodliness. Now what's ungodliness, brothers and sisters? Well, ungodliness is the word used to describe people who say they are godly, but are not. They're ungodly. They say they've got a relationship with God, but their actions prove otherwise. That's why they're called ungodly. You want to have a look at the 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, and you'll see that's the description of those who are in the truth, and the judgment seat are rejected, because they should be godly, and they're not. They're ungodly. I want to show you in a minute that Lamech thought he was the paragon of virtue. In fact, Lamech was actually teaching that he was the seed of the woman of the promise of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. Okay? He was claiming to be the seed of the woman. So what was happening is that in these two lines, the gentleman over here, who was the paragon of corruption, had shifted himself over here, so to speak. He was saying that he was the seed of the woman. If you don't believe me, just hang on. I'll demonstrate it to you. And so Enoch says, no, you're not. You're not the seed of the woman. You're corrupt. And the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his saints. He's talking about the ultimate judgment, of course, isn't he? The ultimate judgment upon the earth. And he's going to destroy all those like you, Lamech, that are claiming to be the seed of the woman or part of the community of Christ. And you're not. Okay? So that's, without going on to too many other tangents, because we could go on for hours, let's just leave it at that. What we do know is this, brothers and sisters, that because Enoch said these words, Lamech was after his skin. Lamech was going to kill him. And so God translated Enoch. In other words, he picked him up from where he was at age 365 and he moved him somewhere else. And in Hebrews chapter 11, Paul tells us about that. He says Enoch was translated that he should not see death. And people were looking for him, because it says, and he was not found, which means they were searching for him. He was translated that he should not see death. What kind of death? Normal death, like you and I will one day die if Christ doesn't come when we think he will? Does he mean that death? No, because all men die, don't they? You're going to read Genesis chapter 5, supported by 1 Corinthians 15 verse 22. As in Adam, all die. So Enoch died, Elijah died. They were just removed somewhere else to live out their days. The reason that Enoch was translated is because Lamech wanted to murder him, and God wasn't going to permit that. Enoch walked with God in the same way that God saved Noah, who walked with him. He saved Enoch, who walked with him. And he removed him from the danger of being murdered by Lamech. Now you think I'm right on this? Come back to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. You all know in Genesis 5 it says, it talks about the generations of Adam, and he died, and he died, and he died. Well, Enoch died too, but he was removed at age 365 so that he wouldn't be murdered by Lamech. Genesis chapter 4 tells us about Lamech. Now we don't want to read from verse 19 when the story begins, but this is the rebellious house of Lamech. He was the father of all sorts of things, even of those who produce rock and roll music. Did you know that? Yeah. So you've got, what have you got here? Have a look. The principles of Lamech's house were permissiveness, verse 19, profit, verse 20, pleasure, verse 21, power, verse 22, and he has sons like this. In fact, he had 2 wives. He was the first polygamist. And he had the best of both worlds. Look at his wives in verse 19. He had Adar, her name means adorned. Clearly, it's sort of like a subtle reference to her beauty, to her physical beauty. Then he had Zillah. Zillah's name means shade, or one hovering over, like a shade does, hovers over you. So he had a beautiful woman with whom he would consort for obvious reasons, And he had a woman who was there to serve him, hovering at, what could I do for you now, dear? Do you want a cup of coffee? You know. So he had the best of both worlds. He had a servant and he had a beautiful woman. So he's the first polygamist. And everything this man does is about himself. It's about fulfilling the desires of the flesh. So Adar bare Jabal, in verse 20, he was the father of such as dwell in tents. In other words, he was prepared to roam around because he was a cattle rancher. He wanted to take his cattle off to all sorts of fields that he could build up the flock and so on. Flock, herd, I mean. Look at verse 21. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and the organ. Now, that word handle is very interesting. It's the Hebrew word taphas. You know what it means? Literally, it means to manipulate, to seize hold of, to wield, or to use something unwarrantably. It's a reference to the guitar playing of the modern era. You know, what do they do? And most people, play a guitar or some instrument will stand there and, But the idiots who created rock and roll, what do? They're bouncing around and... They're manipulating it, they're using it unwarrantably. So this family even invents rock and roll music. Okay, so as you go on you see the extent of this man's wickedness. And then of course it gets worse, because in verse 22, Zillah, she bare Tubal-Cain. He's named after his forefather, Cain. An instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. What do you think they used them for? Daniel chapter 2 verse 40 says, iron breaks in pieces and bruises. This was weaponry, okay? This is weaponry to kill people with. And he's going to kill someone. Look what he says in verse 23. Now if you don't have this in your Bible, it depends on what translation you got, you need a little bit of adjusting here in verse 23. And Lamech said unto his wives, now I put a comma after the word wives. You got a comma in your Bible? Yeah? Okay, that's good. What you next need to do is to put the what do they call it? Quotation marks. Okay? The quotation marks, because this is what he actually said. Adar and Zillah, which of course is emphasising the fact that he's got two wives, but it's also emphasising something else. Look what he says. Hear my voice. Adam had one wife. And Adam's problem was he listened to the voice of his one wife. Come back to Genesis 3 verse 16. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So she's made even more subject than she was at the beginning. And Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13, 14, 15, says there were two reasons for the subjection of the woman. Adam was first created, then Eve. So the order of their creation was the first principle. But then he says, Eve was the first in the transgression. She's not blamed for the introduction of sin and death. She was deceived by the serpent. Adam wasn't deceived. But she used her body, as Brother Thomas suggests, I believe correctly, in Help Us Israel. Because she had fallen after eating the fruit. She used her body to induce Adam to join her in sin. But he went in with his eyes open. Hence, Paul says in Romans 5:12, by one man, masculine singular in the Greek, by one man sin entered the world. So he's held responsible, not Eve. But she was the first in the transgression. There's your second reason. So there's a pre-fall and a post-fall reason for the subjection of the woman. But look at verse 17 of Genesis 3. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife. I don't need to read any more, do I? God starts out by saying, you're held responsible because you hearkened unto the voice of your wife and you entered into the evil that's brought about this terrible outcome for the human race. Okay? Lamech stands up and says, I'm not going to make Adam's mistake. Adar and Zillah, I got two of you. Hearken unto my voice, because I'm not going to hearken to yours. Got his picture? Hearken to my voice, because I won't make Adam's mistake. And hearken to the voice of my wife. So what's he claiming, brothers and sisters? He's claiming to be the seed of the woman. Read on in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23. He says, "Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding." So there's a past act there. He's killed someone already. "And a young man to my hurt." Now, Rotherham translates it, "For a man have I slain in dealing my wounds, yea, a youth in smiting my blows." The RSV says, "I have slain a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me." Now, what we're being told here is that he had aggregated to himself the authority of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. The only one authorised to kill by God in Genesis 3:15 is who? The seed of the woman. See what it says in Genesis 3:15? "And I will put enmity between thee, the serpent, and the woman." So here you've got the carnal mind of the serpent, the divine mind that the woman initially upheld until she was deceived. Okay? So there's your first enmity or hostility. "And between thy seed," that is the serpent's seed, "and the woman's seed." It's a reference to Christ and his enemies. "He," as it should read, that word "it" there is the Hebrew word "ha." It's in the masculine singular. It should read "he." "He," namely Christ, "shall bruise thy head," the serpent's head, "and thou shalt bruise his heel." Now, if you bruise a head, what does that mean? You kill him. The only one authorised to kill is the seed of the woman. Okay? So Lamech is saying, I have killed a man already for wounding me. I am the seed of the woman. So what we have got here is the transition of one who is in the line of the seed of the serpent, transitioning himself into the line of the seed of the woman, and who claims to be that one. Right? Now, that's hideous, isn't it? It's exactly why Jude picks it up. Because in the ecclesia of his day, there were people who had come in not converted and were starting to rule the ecclesia, claiming to be in Christ. Right? But they weren't in Christ. See, that's the problem here. So that, brothers and sisters, is where this chapter begins. Because you see, it culminates in the rebellion of Nimrod post-flood, as we're going to see. So what happened? Well, let's summarise. Lamech arrogated to himself the title, the seed of the woman. And that's why we have, as these two lines come together, we have the apostasy that led to only one family holding the truth. 1656 years after the creation of man. What a terrible situation that is. Whereby, says Peter, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And God wiped them all away because they had listened to the words of Lamech and had joined him in apostasy. So let's just come back and see where we're up to. We've considered thus far most of what appears in those 4 sections and dividing up this study. We've just had read Genesis chapter 10, which is about the division of the nations. Why does this division of the nations occur? Well, it occurs because of the events of Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. So that's what we're going to consider in this study. Oops, sorry about that. So what we have here is the development of the rebellion of Nimrod, the building of the Tower of Babel. So come to Genesis chapter 11 with me. Genesis 11, verse 1. "And the whole earth was of one language, one safar, one lip, as it could read, and of one speech." The word speech is debar, one word. Debar is the word that Yahweh uses of his own word in the Old Testament. So there are one lip, one word. What does that mean? Well, originally, they all had the same religion. When they came out of the ark, they were all Christadelphians, if we can use the contemporary term. The whole family was in the truth. They all had one religion. And that's what it means in verse 1. I'm not just talking about the fact they spoke Hebrew, which is God's own language. They all had the religion of that language. And they say that Hebrew is the finest language for praise and religion. Why wouldn't it be? It's God's own personal tongue. So of course it's going to be the very best language for praise and religion. And they all had it, but apostasy changed all of that, didn't it? Within 100 years, there was a huge apostasy against the truth. It's always happened in history. And of course, the man responsible for that is largely Nimrod. Not just Nimrod, by the way, his father Cush has got a lot to do with this, as we're going to see. Okay? And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now, Shinar just happens to be the Hebrew form of the name Semiramis. And Semiramis just happened to be the wife of Nimrod. Okay? So what we have here is the roots of all prophecy, brothers and sisters. Semiramis is the type of the woman of Revelation chapter 17, who sits astride a scarlet-coloured beast. Let me demonstrate that to you. Semiramis, the wife of Nimrod. Her name is the Hellenized form. Semiramis is the Hellenized form, that's Greek form, of the Akkadian name, okay, Semiramis. It means gift of the sea. Semir, when translated into Hebrew, becomes Shinar, the biblical name for Lower Mesopotamia. So when you read Semiramis, read Shinar. When you read Shinar, read Semiramis. They are interchangeable. Legend says she was raised by doves, the symbol of peace and rest. It's a hint to Noah, of course, because he sent a dove out, didn't he? And ultimately, what did the dove come back with in its beak? An olive branch. Well, guess what Semiramis' seal is? Here it is, there's the doves. This is on the back of her seal, because she was the queen of the area of that entire region of Mesopotamia, is a dove with a olive branch. They say that she came out of the ark. So they created this legend about Semiramis. She came out of the ark. She's God's gift to the nations. Yeah, little wonder that she becomes the type of the Catholic Church. God's gift to the nations. Okay. So here we've got the roots of all prophecy. She looked a bit like this. Now this is not Semiramis. This is Queen Shubad of Ur in the time of Abraham. Okay, so Abraham, when he walked around the streets, saw women, gaudy women, like that. And that's what Semiramis would have looked like. She would have had some sort of regalia like that. Now this is the only known facial image of Nimrod. It's a little bit beaten up, isn't it? Time has sort of beaten it up a little bit. But this is the only known image of Nimrod. And he just happened to be the 13th generation from Adam. So you had Adam, Cain, Enoch, the first city was named after him, Irad, Mehujael, Methusael, Lamech, that's the one we've been talking about in Jude verse 14, remember, whom Enoch condemned. Then there was 3 more to the flood, to Noah, and there's Ham and Cush and then Nimrod. 13th generation. And of course, his name just happens to mean the rebel, or we will rebel. And what's the number of rebellion in the Bible? 13. Yeah. You find that out when you raise children. When they get to 13, yeah, you find that out, don't you? That 13 is the number of rebellion. And you've got passages like Genesis 14, verse 4, which says that they served Kedorlaomer for 12 years, and in the 13th, they rebelled. Okay, so we know that 13, I can give you tons of proof of that. No problem with that at all. So 13 is the number of rebellion. And of course what they did here is they wanted to build a tower. Now we're going to see in our sessions tomorrow why they wanted to build a tower. But this is what they did. Now this is Peter Bruegel's, he was a Flemish artist, a fanciful depiction of the Tower of Babel. He actually used the Colosseum in Rome as the basis for it. I want to show you how important that is tomorrow. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, we read in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 8. And they left off to build a city. So how did he scatter them? Well, we know what he did. And we're going to see that once we come to this. Now, he confused their tongues, didn't he? So, verse 7, let us go down and there confound their language, their lip, which they used to use to speak right doctrine, okay? Let us confound their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the whole earth. And they called it Babel, or confusion. So this was how the nations were divided, the ones we read about in Genesis chapter 10. This is how that division occurred. There were 70 nations from Shem, Ham and Japheth. So just come back and have a quick summary with me of the content of Genesis chapter 10. In verses 2 to 5, we have 14 nations from Japheth. Only 14. Now, isn't that curious? Because in verses 6 to 20, you have 30 nations from Ham. And in verses 21 to 32, you have 26 nations from Shem. Now, 14 is less than half of the 30 from Ham. It's a little under, a bit more than half of the 26 nations from Shem. But what did we read about Japheth in chapter 9? God shall enlarge the enlarger. I would have thought they only had 14. You're not going to keep pace with someone who's got 30, are you? But he did, see, because God was involved in the fulfilment of that prophecy. Now, when you do this count, and I would recommend you do this for yourself, when you do this count in Genesis 10, if you want to confirm that what I've said is correct, count the names only once and omit Noah, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and the names of cities that you come across. And you'll find that what's on the screen there is perfectly accurate. 14 from Japheth, 30 from Ham, and 26 from Shem. Now, there's the table of nations again. So here they are. This is Japheth, entire northern region, just 14. Here's Shem, 26, what was a relatively small area, you see. And, of course, Africa, 30 from Ham, including the land of Canaan. Okay, so that's how the division of the nations came about. Now, there's nothing very difficult about that, is there? That's pretty straightforward. History demonstrates it anyway. So, one modern scholar has actually said that he's traced all existing languages on earth today to 3 original sources, says Edersheim. Those 3 original sources are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. All languages came from them through this confusion of the tongues. So let's have a look then. Now, this is where I want you to really join me and focus your mind. Pull on that thinking cap and let's work together on the record of Genesis chapter 10 from verse 21 onwards, because there are some curiosities here. What do we read there in verse 21? Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. Now you'll notice that when you read about these 3 sons of Noah, you don't read of Japheth first, do you? In chapter 10 verse 1, it's Shem, Ham and Japheth. So what's that about, do you think? Well, it's the same in verse 18 of chapter 9, Shem, Ham and Japheth. But it's obvious from Genesis 10:21 that Japheth is the elder of the sons. Shem's always put first. I wonder why. Well, Shem is the one from whom the Semites came, the Jews came, you see. And that's why we're told here in verse 21, he's the father, is Shem, of all the children of Eber. But, excuse me, Eber is number 11 in the list that follows. So why are we being told that Shem is the father of all the children of Eber? That doesn't seem to make any sense to me. Because when you read down, you've got to get down to verse 25 before you come to him. He's number 11 in this list. Okay? Now, there's got to be something being said here. Well, Eber, as a name, comes from the root Eber. It means to go across on the opposite side. And guess what Eber did? He just happens to be contemporary with Nimrod. He just happens to be there at the time when they were going to build this tower in defiance of Yahweh to escape another flood, by the way. Right? And he refused to be involved. He refused to be involved. The primary root, abar, which means to cross over, is used widely of any transition. It occurs 29 times in Joshua 1 through 4 of Israel passing over the Jordan. In Genesis 14 and verse 13, Abram is described as Abram the Hebrew. Why? Well, he just crossed over the Euphrates from Haran. He got baptised, so to speak, in crossing over. Okay? That is, he was an Eberite, a Hebrew, or a descendant of Eber. So why is this man Eber so important in the scheme of things? Well, he's the root of the name, root of the word Hebrew, and that's very important, obviously. But this is what one historian says about Eber and Hebrew. Muslim historian of the 13th century, Abu al-Fida, relates the story that the patriarch Eber, an ancestor of Abraham, was allowed to keep the original tongue, Hebrew in this case, because he would not partake in the building of the Tower of Babel. So when Nimrod gathered together his confederacy of peoples and he said, "You follow me," and we're going to see the reasons why he said that a little later on, "You follow me," Eber said, "Not me, mate. You can leave me out." And so when God confused the languages of the builders of the tower, he left Eber with his own language, God's language, Hebrew. Interesting, isn't it? And he becomes the father of the Hebrews. And Abram is called Abram the Hebrew. Yeah, we're going to see where Abram came from a little later on in our study. So let's have a look at the situation here after the flood. We have the patriarchal line. We've got Noah, who was 600 years of age at the time of the flood. He lived another 350 years, died at age 950. His son Shem lived to 600 years and he died up here. Arphaxad, 438, Salah, 433, Eber, 464, Peleg, 239. So you see how it's descending down. Ru, 239, Sereb, 230, Nahor, 148, Terah, 205, and Abram, 175. So there's your ages of the folk who came from the family of Noah through the line of Shem. So look at that. Noah was still alive when Abram was middle-aged. Interesting, isn't it? And, moreover, Eber, the father of the Hebrews, overlived Abram by 4 years. That's interesting. But there was someone else who overlived Abraham. Yeah. His name was Shem. He died 35 years after Abraham. And we think Shem was Melchizedek, remember? Yeah, Genesis chapter 14. Interesting, isn't it, when you look at the ages of these patriarchs. The flood, within 100 years, had produced the apostasy out of a family that had the truth. And so God divides the peoples by dividing their tongue. He took away his tongue from them, brothers and sisters, because his tongue represents truth, and they'd lost the truth. So he takes it away. Now, come with me then to Genesis 10, and we'll work our way down to verse 25. We read verse 21. Then in verse 22, we've got the children of Shem, and they're spelled out. I'm not going to read them all again. Come down to verse 24. And Arphaxad begat Salah, and Salah begat Eber. So here's our man. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. Now, as we're going to see, the earth divided here is the confusion of the tongues of Genesis chapter 11, verses 7 and 8. This is what it means when the earth was divided. The tongues, the languages were confused. For in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Okay, so Peleg is named because he was born at the time when the languages were confused, from 1 to 70. And they couldn't, of course, pass me a brick. Someone spoke that in German, he had no idea what he was talking about. So they couldn't continue building. They couldn't communicate with each other. So they all went their separate ways. 70 different languages ended up developing 70 different nations. They finally found their fellows and they joined together. Okay, got a picture of that? So here's this name Peleg, division. Strong suggests the division of an earthquake. The root means a channel or a canal. It occurs 7 times in the Old Testament. 7 times. Why would that be the case? 7's the covenant number, remember? Genesis 9. I'll set my bow in the clouds, in the sky. The covenant number. In his days was the earth divided. Badal is the Hebrew word. It signifies to divide by distinguishing. To make a distinction. And the distinction was in the languages they spoke. Now, that word is used, as you can see, variously in the Old Testament. It's clearly a reference to the division of the nations that occurred because of the apostasy, the rebellion of Nimrod. So there's a divine commentary on this. And that divine commentary is in Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. Now this is critical, brothers and sisters. If God comments on something elsewhere in the scripture, it's critical to understand what he was doing in the original place. And he's talking here about Genesis 10 and 11. And Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9 says, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Now what's that telling us, do you think? How many sons did Jacob have? 12? Yeah, true. How many nations were brought about in Genesis 10 and 11? 70. Wow. Is this a problem, do you think? No, it's not a problem. Jacob had 12 sons, and 12's the number of Israel, isn't it? But in Genesis 46 verse 27, when he came into Egypt, we are told he had 70 sons. 70 sons and grandsons. So his family was 70 in number when he came into Egypt. So what we've got here is 12 and 70. Now does this work? Yes, this works in Scripture. And I'll show you that a little later on. So what we have here is this division. In his days, the days of Peleg, was the earth divided. So we have Noah, there's his son Shem, and these are the sons who came from him. From Aram came these. From Arphaxad came Salah. And number 11 in this list is Eber, the Hebrew. And he has a son called Peleg, division, divided. And he's number 12 in the list. What's the number 12 the number of? Israel. Yes. So you with me? Yeah. You need to keep pulling that cap on, okay? And then he's got a brother, Joktan, and we'll come to him in a minute. Let's go to the other side of the equation. Let's go to Ham. There's Cush, the father of Nimrod. Okay, so Nimrod is the son of Cush. But we've got all these people listed off in the line of Ham. Got a picture of that? Right. The division comes here because of the rebellion of Nimrod. That's why this boy, when he's born, his father has refused to be involved. The angels come down, confuse their tongues. A child is born to Eber, and he calls him division. Because that's what was happening at the time when he was born. His name memorialises the confusing of the tongues of the people of that day. Yeah. So what about his brother? Come to Genesis 10 and verse 26 through 29. See, at the end of verse 25 it says, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now Joktan is the 13th name in the list. What's 13 number of? Rebellion. He just happens to have 13 sons. Well, that's accidental, of course. 13 sons. As I said, 13 is the biblical number of rebellion. Genesis 14:4, Mark 7:21 to 22 is a list of what comes out of the heart of man. What is it? Yeah, evil thoughts. Then you get the list. How many are there? 13. Evil thoughts and another 12. 13. Nimrod was the 13th generation from Adam. His name means we will rebel. Then you go on and you have a look and see what happens here. This man's name, Joktan, means he will be made little. Really? Why? Well, because of rebellion. That's why. His numerical value, this man's name has a numerical value of 169. Now you know, of course, that every Hebrew word and every Greek word has a numerical value. Therefore, every sentence has a numerical value. In the Hebrew, he's got a numerical value of 169, which just happens to be 13 times 13. He had 13 sons. And the numerical value of the 13 sons of Joktan is 2,756, which just happens to be 212 times 13. Can you see what's happening here, brothers and sisters? I'll tell you what's happening. God is saying, I am not going to be defeated by Nimrod. He has rebelled against me. I've confused the tongue. Babylon becomes into existence. Babylon becomes the type of Catholicism and all that belongs to that. The system of Nimrod, I am not going to be defeated. I am eventually going to get all of these peoples back into one nation, and that nation is going to be called Israel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a man from the very heart of Nimrodian apostasy. His name's Abram. He lives in the city of Ur the Chaldees, one of the principal cities of Nimrodian apostasy. I'm going to start with him. By the time I'm finished with him, at the end of 7,000 years, there'll just be one nation left on earth, and that nation will be the nation called Israel. All those 70 nations will no longer exist. They'll all be brought back into the nation of Israel. We have the roots of all Bible prophecy here. Okay. But there's something else here. This is what I love about the scripture. That's clearly, what I've just said to you is clearly what God's on about here. But look at the beauty of this. He says, when the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, he divided them according to the number of the children of Israel. Jacob initially had 12 sons. So when you come back to these lists, this is the list of Genesis chapter 10, this is 21 to 32. The list of Shem. But if you include Shem, the father, and you run down that list, Sarah's number 11. Who's number 12? Eber, the father of the Hebrews, the nation of Israel. But what about we go next door to the list of Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 to 32, the generations of Shem. We go there, and this is the list. Shem, Arphaxad, Salah, Eber, number 4 in this list. So who's number 12? Jacob, the father of Israel. Really? It's staggering, isn't it? It's staggering the way that the Spirit presents these things. Could you have done that? You think? No. But that's what the Spirit does for us, brothers and sisters. So what about these two numbers, 12 and 70? 12 is the number of Israel. 70 is the number of the nations, or the Gentiles. To the Jew first, then to the Gentiles is the way God works, isn't it? So what do you mean? In Exodus chapter 15, verse 27, when Israel comes from Marah, the place of bitterness, to a place called Elim, which means the place of the mighty ones, they see a vision of the kingdom. What do they see there? 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. So the palm trees are drawing their sustenance from 12 wells. That's the kingdom age, isn't it? The 70 nations drawing their sustenance from the nation of Israel. Yes. And when you come to Luke chapter 9 verse 1, you read that Christ sends 12 disciples to preach the gospel. But in chapter 10 verse 1 he sends 70 disciples to preach the gospel 2 by 2. I wonder why. Well, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. Okay? And in Revelation chapter 7 verses 4 to 8 you read about this multitude of 144,000, which is what? 12 times 12,000. Why 12, I wonder? Well, it's the Israel of God, isn't it? But who are these people? Verse 9 tells you that they're the redeemed out of all nations, and all of them have got palm branches in their hand, and the palm is the symbol of the nations in the scripture. You see the way it works, brothers and sisters? There's nothing beyond here that doesn't have its roots here in Genesis. All of it. And when the flood occurred, God did something he's going to do again very shortly, when Armageddon occurs and the great earthquake reshapes this world. I want to ask you, you've ever thought about how many plates of the earth's crust will there be post-Armageddon? Are we going to have volcanoes and earthquakes in the millennial age, do you think? Anybody ever thought about that? Do you think the earth's going to be afflicted by volcanoes and earthquakes in the millennial period of the 1,000-year reign? Of course not. Why not? Well, because you see, we're going to end up with one plate. The earth's crust will be firm. Not like it is now. Because you see, whenever God shakes the earth like that, he gives a prophecy of what's coming. So guess what we got out of the flood? 12 tectonic plates. What was he saying? I can see the rebellion coming. I'm going to divide the tongues of this people into 70, the nations. But they're not going to beat me. Because I'm going to get them all back into one nation, the nation of Israel. So I'll put 12 plates there. But the events of Armageddon, we're going to have one plate. Why? Because 1,000 years later, all of those nations are going to belong to one nation called Israel. It's a prophecy. It's the way God works, isn't it? Because Israel is the only immortal nation. The testimony of Jeremiah chapter 30 is, though I make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee, O Israel, I will not make a full end of thee. Words repeated in Jeremiah 46:28. Don't need to read them, do I? Exactly the same words. Twice in the prophecy of Jeremiah. Why? Because Israel is the only immortal nation. They'll be the only nation left on earth. So this prophecy is fulfilled. When the Most High divided the nation into inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Initially 12, then 70, when he came into Egypt. Why? For Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Just one nation. After the 7th millennium and into the 8th. And that was all prefigured, of course, in the Feast of Tabernacles, wasn't it? If you go to Numbers 29, you read about the Feast of Tabernacles from verse 13 onwards. And we are told that over the 7 days of that feast, so here's your 7 days, on day 1 they offered 13 bullocks. They offered the same number of rams and lambs. Same number, every day. But not bullocks. On day 2, they offered 12 bullocks. On day 3, they offered 11. On day 4, they offered 10. On day 5, they offered 9. On day 6, it was 8. On day 7, they offered 7. I wonder why. They begin with the number of Nimrod's rebellion. What's the feast the nations will keep in the kingdom age and millennium? Zechariah 14 verse 16. All the nations who came against Jerusalem will come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. I wonder why. Because it speaks about their incorporation in the one nation of Israel. That's why. So God starts with the 13 bullocks of the rebellion of Nimrod, and he ends with the 7th, the number of the covenant the number of the covenant and the number of the Sabbath rest of the millennium. And it's during the millennium that these nations will all be incorporated into the nation of Israel, which is why the last holy convocation in Israel's religious year, the very last one, was the next day after the Feast of Tabernacles had ended. It was like an eighth day. It spoke of the eighth millennium. And on that day, Numbers 29, verses 35 and 36 will tell you, they offered just one bullock. Because in the eighth millennium, there will only be one nation left. And that's the nation called Israel. Roots of all Bible prophecy in Genesis 9 through 12.